Punnett squares. We are going to do a little activity with Punnett squares and some elf examples. So it says Papa Elf and Mama Elf are expanding their family. We're going to help them predict what their baby elf might look like by using Punnett squares to look at their inherited traits, using the descriptions below to complete the Punnett squares. So before we do that, I want you to open your journal to pages 40 and 41, and if 40 and 41 are not side by side, I want you to skip a page so that you can have a side-by-side page. So Punnett squares is going to go on page 40, and genetic vocabulary is going to be on 41, so that they are side by side. We're going to define some of these terms as we use some of these terms. So looking here, we have Papa Elf and we have Mama Elf. And they tell us that Papa Elf has brown eyes, a long nose, and round ears. So we could almost picture him, right, with brown eyes, a long nose, and round ears. We could draw him. We don't have to, but we could. This is the phenotype. If we know the physical appearance, that's what someone looks like. We call that the phenotype. Now, his genetics, his actual genes, are that he has one dominant trait for brown eyes and one recessive trait for blue eyes. He has one dominant trait for a long nose and one recessive trait for his nose, and two recessive traits for round ears. This is the genotype, or the actual genes that Papa Elf has. And then we have Mama with a blue eyes, short nose, pointy ears. That's her phenotype. That's what she physically looks like. And then these are her actual genes: recessive, 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 dominant, dominant. So that's her genotype. So with that in mind, on page 41, we're going to write phenotype, and we're going to underline the PH in phenotype, and we're going to put that that's the physical appearance. Underline the PH, that's how I remember it. Physical and pheno both start with PH. The physical appearance of the traits. What we actually look like. For example, what do you see? Well, you see brown eyes, or you see a long nose, or whatever it is you actually see. That's your phenotype. Now the genotype is the actual genes. All right, so the actual dominant or recessive genes. For example, capital B is dominant, lowercase b is recessive. That would be a genotype. Or maybe it was capital B, that's a genotype. Or maybe it's little b, that's a genotype. Okay? So that's what we mean when we talk genotype. Now, I've been using two words you may or may not know: dominant and recessive. So a dominant gene is represented with a capital letter, and that dominant gene is going to overshadow or overpower any recessive gene. So that even if you just have one dominant and one recessive, you're not going to get to see the recessive. You'll only see the dominant. Just like if you dominate at a sport, maybe you're dominant on the basketball court. That means that nobody else is going to be able to show off because you are the one that everybody's watching. You're dominant. Okay? Recessive genes are represented with a lowercase letter, or small letter, right? Lowercase. And they only show up or manifest themselves, right? Big word there, manifest. Only show up or manifest if there are no dominant traits or dominant genes. So an example would be little b, right? When we have the same letter, the same size, we say that's homozygous. If we have two different letters, we say it's heterozygous. So heterozygous literally means different. All right? And that means you're going to have one dominant trait or one dominant gene and one recessive. So, for example, capital B, little b. That's dominant, that's recessive. They are not the same, they are different, therefore we call them heterozygous. Now, if we have two of the same type, we call that homozygous. Homo means same. So both traits or both genes are alike. Now, that could be both dominant capital B, or both recessive, little b. We would say this is dominant homozygous, recessive homozygous, all right? And this is just heterozygous because they're different, right? So we're going to use these terms as we talk about our Punnett square. So back here we have 3 Punnett squares. One of these needs a line added, so add that line there. It really doesn't matter which parent you put on the side and which parent you put their genotype across the top, as long as you do it accurately. Okay, so to show you, I'm going to use 2 different colors. I'm going to use purple for Papa Elf, and then I'm going to use pink for Mama Elf. Now, we're just looking at one trait, all right, eye color right now. And Papa Elf's genotype is a heterozygous genotype. He has one dominant and one recessive. So I'm going to put a capital B on one of these columns, and I'm going to put the lowercase b on the second column. Now, I'm going to take Mama's genotype for eye color, which is recessive, homozygous recessive, right? And I'm going to put a little b on one row and a little b on the other row. It really doesn't matter if you have the capital letter first or the capital letter second, but you will notice that most of the time they put it first. So if I have a capital letter, I'm going to start with it. So this half of Papa Elf's genetics, or half of his DNA here, is going to go in this column. So here is the dominant trait that he might pass down, and here is the recessive trait that he might pass down to his offspring. Now, Mama Elf only has recessive traits. This half is going to be a recessive for blue eyes and a recessive for blue eyes. This half is also a recessive trait for blue eyes and a recessive trait for blue eyes. Now, these are the genotypes, but that doesn't really tell us what do they look like. So we have to write in the phenotype. is this offspring going to have brown eyes or is it going to have blue eyes? Well, it has a dominant trait for brown, so that's going to overshadow the blue. So this is going to be a brown-eyed elf. This one has 2 recessive or homozygous recessive. So there are no brown-eyed traits to overshadow anything. So the only thing that's left is the blue eyes. And the same thing here. We've got 1 dominant, 1 recessive. Brown is going to trump the blue, so we're going to have a brown-eyed elf. And here we only have blue-eyed genetics, so we're only going to see the blue. Now we're going to count how many of these 4 offspring are going to have brown eyes. We've got 2 brown-eyed children out of 1, 2, 3, 4 total children possibilities, and so that's 50%. And then we have 2 blue-eyed children out of 1, 2, 3, 4 possibilities, and that's also 50%. So that's the probability that a heterozygous dad and a homozygous recessive mom will have brown or blue eyes. Okay? We're going to skip over nose length for now, and we're going to do pointy ears. So looking at Dad's phenotype, he has round ears. His genotype is recessive P, or homozygous recessive. And so it's really hard to tell recessive and dominant in the letter P, because unless they're on the line. So I'm going to make them really small. All right, and then Mom's phenotype is that she has pointy ears. Her genetics or her genotype is that they are both dominant traits. So she is homozygous dominant. So I'm going to make them giant letter P so that I can tell them apart. Since this is capital, I'm going to start with a capital. So for all the way across, there's what she might donate to the offspring from Mama Elf. And then here's what Dad would donate. Little p, here, this one comes down to here, little p, this one comes down to here, little p. And now I'm going to look at, this is their genotype, which is all heterozygous. But what do they actually look like? What's their phenotype? For ears, if I have a capital P and a little p, the dominant is pointy ears. So that's what's going to show up. So this elf is going to have pointy ears. And this one has a dominant and a recessive. So it's also going to have pointy ears. And this is a dominant and a recessive. So it will have pointy ears. And pointy ears. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 4 that have pointy ears. That's 100%. I have no offspring that have round ears, so 0%. Okay? And then we're going to set this one up, and you're going to do it on your own. So for nose length, Papa Elf has a long nose, which is a capital N and a lowercase n. So I'm going to put a capital N and a lowercase n. Mama Elf has a short nose. This is called homozygous recessive. So she's going to have little n, little n. Now I have a capital letter, so I'm going to start there. So this capital letter goes into the first box, and this capital letter goes into the second box. This lowercase letter goes into the first box. This lowercase letter goes into the second box. And then we take Mom's and we go across. So lowercase n, lowercase n, lowercase n, lowercase n. These are the genotypes. Now we want to figure out the phenotypes. So this elf would have a long nose. This elf would have a short nose. This one would be long because it has one dominant. This one would be short because it doesn't have any dominants. So again, I have 2 out of 4 for long nose at 50%, 2 out of 4 for short nose, 50%. All right, We're going to glue this onto page 40. You might have to fold it in half, or you can trim this edge off to make it fit and fold it in half.